Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. This podcast is recorded and edited on Gadigal land. The United Nations is widely acknowledged as a key world leader on responding to climate change. The massive intergovernmental organization claims to be 95% or more climate neutral. However, they base this claim largely on the use of carbon credits, a contentious method of offsetting emissions that is being increasingly discounted by experts and scientists. The UN's entire offset portfolio is exempt from oversight. Its claims have rarely been scrutinized. So Mongabay teamed up with the outlet The New Humanitarian in a year-long investigation to look into the facts. And reporters found that most of these offsets are either ineffective in combating climate change or are detrimental to environmental or human health.
The UN is spending millions of dollars that could otherwise go toward other solutions. And on top of that, we think that the UN is sometimes positions itself as a moral compass when it comes to addressing the threat of climate change. When they use a solution that doesn't work, they set an example for the major emitters of greenhouse gases, and that could also be a problem.
I spoke with investigative reporter Jacob Goldberg from The New Humanitarian to get more insight into how the UN claims its climate neutrality, and how we found that it isn't indeed climate neutral. Goldberg goes into detail about how reporters were able to uncover these findings, some of the more shocking conclusions, and also how the UN responded after he sent the article to those he spoke with. We also discuss the growing media scrutiny on carbon credits in general, and the reaction this coverage has generated, how corporations themselves sometimes respond, as well as individuals. So Jacob, it's great to have you on the Mongabay Newscast. Welcome, and where are you joining us from?
Hi, it's good to be here. I'm joining from Bangkok.
And how long have you been based in Bangkok?
I've been based in Bangkok for about 3 years, and before that I spent 5 years in Myanmar.
So you're an investigative reporter for The New Humanitarian. Can you sort of give our audience a little bit of insight into how you came to do the work that you do, and what kind of work are you doing with The New Humanitarian?
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't always an investigative journalist. I did all kinds of journalism before as a freelancer and in another few jobs. But at certain points, investigations fell into my lap, and it was a method that I found I enjoyed. And when I saw an opportunity to join the Humanitarian almost a year ago, I decided it would be a good idea to commit a big chunk of my career to perfecting investigations. And the New Humanitarian covers humanitarian crises and the humanitarian aid sector. And in 2021, some colleagues of mine investigated the aid sector's carbon footprint, trying to calculate the annual emissions of the UN and other organizations that provide aid in humanitarian situations. This investigation that we're talking about today is building up on that, trying to answer some of the questions we had after that 2021 investigation was completed.
Right. And so the two organizations we work for, teamed up on this investigation. Can you give a nutshell overview of what this investigation found?
Yes. So I'll start with where we started, and I'll also go into why it was a perfect partnership between the New Humanitarian and Mongabay. So
please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So we found our initial question was trying to understand how the UN could say that they're almost completely climate neutral. They've said they're 95% climate neutral or more every year when they've released their annual emissions reports since 2018. Saying that you are 95, 97, 99% climate neutral implies that you have almost no impact on climate change. It implies that your emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions, are not causing climate change. That is a very bold claim. There needs to be evidence to support that claim. So our investigation wanted to find out what that evidence was. And what we found is that the UN bases its climate neutrality claims on buying millions of carbon credits. And once we found that out, we decided that we should look at the quality of those carbon credits, because carbon credits are a pretty controversial supposed solution to the climate crisis. They vary in quality. Some critics say that carbon credits don't reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They actually serve as permission for organizations to put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So they're controversial. And when we looked at the quality, we found that a lot of the carbon credits that the UN bought came from controversial projects. And some of those projects are ones that Mongabay has produced very, very deep and very informative investigations on in the past. Specifically, the Telespires hydropower project in the Amazon, the Santo Antonio hydropower dam that's nearby. And some of these credits came from a controversial waste to energy plant in New Delhi. So those were a few of the standout projects that produced the carbon credits that the UN bought. But we were also looking at millions of projects, and I and my colleagues at the Humanitarian and Mongabay tried to figure out whether those credits could substantiate the UN's neutrality claims.
And we're gonna get into all of that soon here. First, can we sort of define our terms? What do we mean when we say carbon credits versus carbon offsets? What's the definition of these two things, and what's the difference?
Right, they're pretty much used interchangeably. When you buy a carbon credit, you're saying that you have offset your own emissions. It means that you have paid a certain amount of money to fund a project somewhere else in the world outside of your organization. And the money that you gave to that project allowed it to either destroy a certain amount of greenhouse gas or avoid emitting a certain amount of greenhouse gas. And because your payment allowed them to do that, you allowed the total greenhouse gas in the atmosphere to be lower than it would have been otherwise. And therefore, you can claim that reduction as your own. You can use that amount of greenhouse gas that they avoided to and subtract it from your own annual emissions. You've offset your emissions theoretically, but there's a lot of research showing that those reductions don't really happen. And so when you subtract a certain amount based on those credits, the credit is a certificate guaranteeing that you reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Some of those certificates don't actually reflect real reductions.
So we investigated the credits purchased by 33 UN entities. What's an entity exactly? Can we define that real quick?
Yeah, we were sort of we had to use that vague terminology because of the terminology that the UN uses. The UN is made up of agencies and other specialized organizations, and they use different terminology to refer to them depending on the kind of work they do and maybe how big they are. But there are 40. Every year, the UN puts out a report called Greening the Blue, which shows how much greenhouse gas each organization that's part of the UN emitted that year. In 2022, 48 claimed that they all announced how much they had emitted, but they also all claimed to be 100% climate neutral, 48 out of 52. So we reached out to all of those 48, and we got useful information from 33 of them. And a few ignored us. A few told us that their information was proprietary or was not available. So those millions of carbon credits that we analyzed for their quality came from those 33 entities that did provide information.
So how many carbon credits were purchased exactly? Or at least how many were we able to look into?
Right. So from the information provided by the 33 entities, we tracked down 6.6 million carbon credits. And based on the UN's annual Greening the Blue reports, that should represent 75%, or slightly more than 75%, of all the carbon credits that they bought between 2012 and 2022. So when you see the number 6.6 million carbon credits, theoretically that should represent 6.6 million metric tons of greenhouse gas that they have prevented from entering the atmosphere. but we spoke to many climate science and carbon credit experts about that, and they said that millions of these carbon credits come from projects that cannot be trusted for various reasons.
And actually, I would like to talk about some of those. So more than a dozen projects, these projects that issued the UN's carbon credits, were linked to reports of environmental damage, displacement, or health concerns. So what kind of environmental damage, what kind of displacement, and what kind of health concerns are we talking about here?
Okay. Yeah, so the way that we found this out, and I really wasn't expecting to find these examples of damage, but we just searched every project's name in a search engine and in some environmental databases that show conflict between development projects and local communities. Yeah, and at least more than a dozen of them had people complaining that there was some sort of conflict with the local community. So when it came to displacement, those were mainly in China, and they referred to communities who were displaced to make way for hydropower dams. And an organization called International Rivers has documented those disputes. Some of them claim that those issues have been resolved, but when we asked about that, we couldn't get any more information from the Chinese developers. There was also, I spoke earlier about a waste-to-energy plant in New Delhi. So that's a project that claims to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by producing energy for the electrical grid by burning organic waste. So because a certain amount of energy on the grid is coming from organic waste rather than from fossil fuels, that project can claim that they're lowering the amount of greenhouse gases that city is depending on, and ultimately going in ultimately putting into the atmosphere. But our sources told us, and they spoke to reporters at Mongabay, saying that the Okla waste energy plant doesn't rely on organic waste. It uses mixed waste, which includes plastic. So it's actually burning plastic to produce energy, plastic mixed with diesel. So it's not doing what it claims. It's burning fossil fuels, and it's making people in the community ill, according to a local doctor. The burning plastic puts carcinogenic particles into the air. Burning diesel is not avoiding fossil fuels, and there have been protests for years. There's a Supreme Court case about this project. And nonetheless, the UN is using this to claim that it's lowering emissions and offsetting its emissions.
Did the UN have any response to this when you presented this information to them? What did they say to this?
Yeah, this is one of the parts of the story that I feel like I need to continue working on, because their response was peculiar. They did not respond to any questions about any specific projects, including the ones I've just described to you. All they said is that they rely on the standards set by the Clean Development Mechanism. And the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, is an offsetting system, meaning it includes thousands of projects, which altogether create billions of credits. And it's run by the UN itself, and it was created by countries while they were negotiating the Kyoto Protocol. And it includes various types of projects. So projects that claim to reduce emissions by producing energy from hydropower, from wind power, from organic waste. Some that claim to directly capture and destroy greenhouse gas before they enter the atmosphere. Projects that make factories more efficient and therefore use less fossil fuels and therefore reduce greenhouse gases. Those types vary in quality, and researchers have been pointing this out for a long time, especially when it comes to hydropower and wind power projects. Those might seem like, not for readers of Mongabay, but maybe for people concentrating on where our energy comes from, those might seem innocuous because they're not producing energy from fossil fuels. They're giving us renewable alternative sources.
Right.
But and I didn't get to talk earlier about how some of these hydropower dams that Mongabay has reported on have been extremely disruptive to local communities, have required the destruction of indigenous holy sites, have led to vast deforestation, flooding places where people live and worship.
Right. So that's pretty horrible enough as it is. But let's. I wanted to actually just put a bookmark in this really quick. Can we explain why should hydropower, or why do experts say hydropower, other than the environmental damage and the human rights violations? Why should hydropower not be used to offset carbon emissions?
So, right, like I said, they seem innocuous. They seem like renewable sources of energy, but they don't rely on payment from people who buy carbon credits. They are profitable enterprises. They sell energy and they make revenue. You don't need the UN or any other customer to buy their credits in order for those businesses to be viable. And because they are viable without those payments for carbon credits, then any reduction in emissions that they create would have happened anyway. Meaning, and this is a quality that the experts call a non-additionality. The reductions in greenhouse gases are non-additional. They would have happened anyway, whether or not that project had the opportunity to sell carbon credits. So millions of credits that the UN bought were from these renewable energy projects, hydropower and wind, probably because those are among the most common types of credits available on the market. And they're also considered to be among the lowest quality, the least likely to achieve real reductions in greenhouse gases.
I find it interesting that Vera actually no longer considers hydro as certifiable. Isn't that? I think we point this out in the investigation, right?
We do. We mentioned how a few years ago Vera and another certifier stopped certifying large-scale hydropower because they have a better chance of being profitable on their own. Some small-scale hydropower might rely on revenue from carbon credit sales, but I think there's different ways of approaching quality. Some scientists will sow doubts about types of projects as a whole, and then there's also ratings agencies which will look at the specific details of a project and determine whether its reductions are additional. We looked at both, and we found low quality credits in the UN's portfolio, both rated by professional agencies and that were discussed by scientists.
Circling back really quick to when you mentioned this mechanism that issues the credits. So throughout this investigation, a lot of the UN entities that we spoke with referred us to the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, for all of our questions on how projects got selected to them. Like they referred for us to go to them.
Yes.
We point out in the investigation that it raised the question about what responsibility, if any, the UN entities have in conducting their own due diligence when vetting and buying carbon credits. But it kind of gets a little murky here because UNEP told us that something called the Adaptation Fund randomly assigns projects to the UNFCCC. So the UNFCCC isn't even selecting these projects seemingly. Did we get any more clarification on this random assignment process?
No, we asked, we followed up multiple times, but no, we did not get any additional clarification. The impression that they gave us, their position was that they are credits are randomly assigned by the Clean Development Mechanism to the Adaptation Fund, and then randomly assigned again from the Adaptation Fund to the UNFCCC and all the other UN entities that they procure credits for. They said that they don't discriminate. They said there's no selection process, and they said that they said that was fine because they rely on the standards of the Clean Development Mechanism, which have been disputed for more than a decade.
And do we have any insight into what the standards are of the Clean Development Mechanism that they're using, or did they give us any more insight into that?
So the standards, they vary by project type. So it would be too complicated to get into each one. And their response didn't really get into that. And also those standards are being renegotiated, I think, really frequently. They are updated whenever they're called into question by climate experts.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're not revised, but sometimes they are. But yeah, they vary by project type. But the position of the UNFCCC was that they rely on those standards and that they're vetted by the governments that are investing in these projects, and they are also vetted by third-party evaluators or consultants. And yeah, that's what they say on all their websites, and of course that's what they're going to say. They didn't respond to the criticisms of that we of the climate experts we spoke to, or the ratings agencies that we spoke to, or the allegations of environmental damage or health problems or displacement.
It makes me wonder, has the UN, has any entity of the UN reached out to the new Humanitarian after the publication of this investigation?
I sent it to all the people I spoke to there. One said, thank you for sharing. One asked to revise her job title, but nothing substantive.
Interesting. So in this investigation, we say that the UN spent an average of $1.30. That's, I think, 1.30 USD per credit, which, for some context here, experts say indicate low quality or well below the norm. So can you explain what's the norm for a carbon credit? What theoretically should a carbon credit be selling for?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in carbon credit prices, but we did talk to experts who said that there are credits on the market that come from higher quality certifiers that could up to $100 per credit, and those are the types that European governments tend to buy. They have higher standards, and European governments have actually restricted credits from the Clean Development Mechanism. They did about 10 years ago, and even those that are not $100, I think the average is lower, but probably closer to 10. But the ones that the UN bought some of them were as cheap as 12 cents. And the experts we spoke to said, you can't remove or you can't reduce a metric ton of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere for 12 cents. It doesn't happen. The only reason it would be priced that low is because it's not doing anything.
Right. It sort of makes me, I've spoken to a lot of experts on the podcast about carbon credits over the past couple of years. And they also point out the fact that, if you're paying for, let's say, a tree to remain in the ground, you're not just paying for the tree, you're also paying for the livelihoods of the people that live in and around that forest, because they can't use the forest. They can't use it. And so you need to be paying for that as well. And so it feels like $1.30 isn't anywhere close to being substantive enough for that.
No, it doesn't seem like it.
The team found that of the credits that were able to be analyzed, 51% of them were deemed as high risk by the Carbon Offset Guide. So what is the Carbon Offset Guide? And then what makes a project high risk exactly? Okay.
Right. The Carbon Offset Guide is it's a very helpful document that was released by the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute a few years ago. And it, I think for a beginner like I was at the beginning of this project, it explains everything you need to know about carbon credit quality and the various types of carbon credits on the market. They go into the reasons why every type of credit would be high or low quality. And the guide assigns a generalized value of high risk, medium risk, or low risk to every major type of carbon credit on the market. They assign that value. There's a few criteria, but the most important one is the one we discussed earlier, which is additionality. Does that project require does it depend on revenue from carbon credit sales? The ones that are categorized as high risk are the ones that, according to the guide, are the least likely to rely on carbon credit sales. And we found that 51%, a majority of the credits in the UN's portfolio were categorized as high risk. And just to be clear, we assigned that 51% based on just the types of projects that the UN's credits belong to. That doesn't mean that we analyzed each individual project.
And so then what is a low risk carbon offset exactly then? Like, what would be an example of that?
Yeah. An example of a low risk project, according to the guide, would be greenhouse gas abatement projects, which are, I guess, they're machinery installed in factories to capture and destroy certain very potent greenhouse gases before they enter the atmosphere. Some experts consider these to be the highest quality on the market because there's no financial incentive to destroy these greenhouse gases, and therefore the only incentive would be carbon credit sales. And they also destroy very potent greenhouse gases, much more potent than carbon dioxide. So some experts would say these are the highest quality, mainly because there's no other financial incentive for them. But they also have raised other issues in the past, in the 2000s, because scientists realized that there was a period when some of these factories were overproducing these harmful greenhouse gases simply to sell more carbon credits, which means they weren't reducing greenhouse gases that would have been in the atmosphere anyway. They were reducing an inflated amount of greenhouse gases. So that lowered the quality of those credits. That particular problem was corrected in a revision to the Clean Development Mechanisms standards. But there are other issues. They were extremely complicated, and so we didn't weigh in on whether we agreed that those were high or low quality. But yeah, some would say those are the lowest risk, the highest quality.
So it was noted in this in here that a joint investigation by Greenpeace and The Guardian found carbon credits issued for forest protection are based on a flawed system. I mean, we've sort of already talked about this at length throughout our conversation here. But it also noted that there was an airline, or some airlines were implicated in this investigation as purchasing offsets through those carbon credits. But now they're simply instead just ditching offsets altogether and investing in reducing their emissions, like directly. Can you elaborate on what happened there?
I can a bit. It's been a while since I read that Guardian investigation, but it was very influential to me. So yeah, you described the problems earlier with forestry related carbon credits. Trees suck a certain amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So if you pay for trees to be maintained or planted or to prevent them from being deforested, then you can claim the greenhouse gas reductions by those trees. I think The Guardian found that a lot of those tracts of forest were not creating real reductions because they were not under threat of being deforested anyway. So your payment for the carbon credit is not changing the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere at the end of the day. And in this case, that was because those trees were not going to be cut down. Then the credit is not valid. But some companies were buying these credits and then using them to offset their emissions. And EasyJet, I think it was,
right,
decided not to buy those credits and reduce their emissions directly, which is more difficult, I think.
It should be noted, however, just a few days after I had this conversation with Jacob, it was widely reported in multiple business and aviation outlets that EasyJet became the first airline to sign an agreement with Airbus and their new carbon capture offer, whereby Airbus will use direct air carbon capture and storage technology to provide airlines with carbon removal credits.
I think airlines are doing it by coming up with more sustainable fuel. I don't know the chemical composition of it or how that works, but I think that's a question we had was, or actually, I think that the challenge for most organizations is that you can't just reduce all your emissions directly. It's very, very difficult. There's only so much renewable energy available, depending on where you are in the world. And people and organizations and companies, we depend on fossil fuel. You cannot, it's very hard to unilaterally switch to 100% renewable energy. And we recognize that about the UN and its operations around the world. But I think what is within the UN's hands is whether to buy low quality credits and whether to then claim to be climate neutral, which our investigation pointed out the evidence does not support.
So I think it's fair to say that media coverage of carbon credits has been, pretty critical. And I've seen a lot of hot takes on social media about people getting angry about that media scrutiny. But it seems like to me it's pretty necessary to look closely at and ensure that we're actually, it's necessary for us to look closely at carbon credits or the claims made by carbon credits if we want to meet climate goals, especially if we're putting so much money into something that isn't doing anything or in some cases is actually actively hampering progress. It seems like you would want more accurate scrutiny around that. But I see a lot of people getting upset about it. Do you have any thoughts or comments about that?
Yeah, I've seen that too. I think the reason why they get upset about it is because when you criticize carbon credits, you're taking away the most convenient solution to the climate crisis that they know about. All you have to do is click a box when you buy a flight or go on a UN website and buy a certain number of credits, and then you're absolved of all of your emissions for that year. It's very cheap. And I think some people, they want positive stories about climate. They are they're turned off by the doom and gloom, and maybe they don't see evidence of the threat of climate change around them necessarily, or maybe not yet. And then they don't understand that the situation is so dire and needs only solutions that are based in science. But there's another reaction that I've gotten, which is that why would you investigate this? Obviously, carbon credits don't do anything. Who cares?
Yeah.
Who cares if the UN and they're not the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world? Like, you should go after the energy companies or the steel producers or concrete producers. And my response to that is that it's quite notable that the UN is behind the times on this. Carbon credits came and then went out of fashion over the last 10 or so years, and now everybody knows that they are dubious. But the UN is still stands by them and says we stick with we believe in the standards of the clean development mechanism, even though they've been criticized by scientists for more than a decade. And also, the UN is spending millions of dollars that could otherwise go toward other solutions. And on top of that, we think that the UN is sometimes positions itself as a moral compass when it comes to addressing the threat of climate change. And when they use a solution that doesn't work, they set an example for the major emitters of greenhouse gases, and that could also be a problem.
I've spoken to some experts in my reporting, and some actually government officials who have said that they acknowledge the criticism that carbon credits are getting, but they're arguing that this is just sort of like the initial growing pains of a new system. What's your response to that take?
I think I would have to be more of an expert to really know about that, because, like I said before, there are types of credits that some scientists consider the highest quality, and then other scientists will say no, they're not. Mm-hmm. They don't do anything. So I think that this is a very polarizing topic. And I think as a non-expert, it's hard to wrap your head around it when a credit is not a physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an idea and sometimes a certificate. If you don't spend hours and hours trying to really understand what it is and how it works, I don't think your opinion on it is going to be close to the reality. And sometimes I think that mine is I still have a lot to learn about it, but I do trust the scientists I spoke to. If carbon credits, if someone could really guarantee that they reduced emissions, I would love to have a convenient solution, but we're not there, I don't think. And all the experts I spoke to said direct reductions are the only way to go. That presents other problems. It's very expensive to directly reduce your emissions. It's not necessarily in any individual's control whether to reduce your emissions. It's really governments that have to end fossil fuel subsidies and redirect funding toward renewable energy, and that happens on a much higher level than I have access to. I have nothing comforting to say about the situation we're in, but I think learning about it still was rewarding.
Other than the things that we've covered, what was the most surprising thing to you about this investigation, or what were you just totally not expecting to find?
I was not expecting to get access to millions of UN credits. I thought I started out, with a few emails where some of the UN entities had sent me a list of maybe like 5 or 7 projects with a few credits, maybe a few hundred. I didn't know that I was going to end up looking at a spreadsheet with millions of credits. I wasn't prepared to analyze them, but I and my colleagues developed a method along the way, especially Leo Salzenstein, who was really good at analyzing data.
Are you able to share what that method is, or like what went behind that, or is that kind of?
No, it's nothing complicated. It was really just what required some trial and error was how to organize how to organize the data and the values we assigned them in order to figure out what to group them by quality. It wasn't scientific. It was really just data entry. But it took some thought to make sure that we could do that. That we would start in one way and be able to carry through the entire investigation, and we had to rearrange many times along the way.
I think it's really worth noting here that the entire offset portfolio is exempt from oversight, correct? And yet you were still able to just get access to it. I thought that was pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I just got access. I asked for these records. Some entities said no, and there's really nothing I can do about that. But most said yes. I had to spend months reminding them. And I think maybe the reason why they volunteered to give me evidence that ultimately undermined their climate neutrality claims was that the entities that gave me that data have just absolutely nothing to do with the process. They are just assigned them, and like we said earlier, they're assigned randomly. And I think these certificates just lie around. The fact that they have the certificates gives them comfort that they're climate neutral, but they don't understand what they are. So I don't. Maybe they were not anticipating scrutiny. But yeah, I'm very grateful that they shared the information with us. We couldn't have done it without them.
So what's next? Are you doing any follow-up reporting on this? Have you heard of anything that you think people should pay attention to right now?
Yeah. So I would really like to get responses to all the specific questions we sent to the UNFCCC toward the end of our investigation about specific projects that have caused damage, that are considered low quality. I still want those answers, and I do plan to follow up. Another thing is, I think we've made a compelling case about, or I think we've come to pretty strong conclusions about the evidence that of the UN's neutrality and how the evidence does not support that claim. We presented it to the UNFCCC. I would be very curious to see what they say on their next Greening the Blue report, which I've heard comes out at the end of November. are they going to claim to be climate neutral? Are they going to, are individual entities going to claim to be climate neutral? Are they going to continue buying low quality carbon credits? Are they going to make such fanfare over these purchases as they have in the past? They clearly see a benefit to claiming they're climate neutral. What are they going to do now that there's a drawback? I'll be covering that when the report comes out.
Well, I'll be looking forward to it. So Jacob, we know we can find the investigation at Mongabay.com. Where can they find it on the New Humanitarian?
You can find it at thenewhumanitarian.org.
And if people want to follow you or follow your work, where can they do that?
You can find it at thenewhumanitarian.org, or you can also find me on Twitter or X. And my handle is my last name Goldberg, but with a 6 instead of a G in the beginning. So 6 Oldberg. Just look up Jacob Goldberg. Check it out.
Awesome. All right, Jacob, it was a pleasure having you on today, and I really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this pretty big investigation.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and thank you also to your colleagues, editors, and reporters for contributing to this investigation.
Yeah, our pleasure. You can read the full investigation by Mongabay and the New Humanitarian here in the show notes of this episode. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay newscast or any of our podcast content on our sister series, Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, please spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach. You can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so even just $1 per month helps us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. You can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to follow us on social media, find Mongabay on most of the social platforms out there, including LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, with our handle at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. As always, we really appreciate you for tuning in. Thanks for listening.